When both you and the narcissist go completely quiet, the world doesn't settle into calm. It actually explodes internally because somewhere in that silence, someone finally loses their grip on control, and it's not you. Most people assume that mutual silence signals the end of the story, but the reality is much stranger than that. Silence can look like an ending from the outside, but internally, it can become the moment when everything that was hidden beneath the surface begins to rise. When two people stop communicating, the absence of words often creates a space where emotions become louder. The conversations that never happened, the feelings that were never expressed, and the questions that were pushed aside can suddenly become impossible to ignore. The silence does not erase the connection. Instead, it reveals what the connection was built on. In relationships with intense emotional patterns, silence can feel especially powerful because the usual cycle has been interrupted. There is no argument to continue, no message to analyze, no reaction to chase, and no immediate reassurance to hold on to. The familiar rhythm disappears, leaving both people alone with their own thoughts. For the person who is constantly seeking answers, this silence can initially feel overwhelming. The mind naturally tries to fill the empty space. It wonders what the other person is thinking, whether they care, whether they regret their actions, or whether they have moved on. The absence of information can create a storm of possibilities, but silence also has a way of exposing reality. Without the constant emotional exchange, patterns become easier to recognize. You may begin to see not only the moments of affection, but also the moments of confusion, inconsistency, and emotional exhaustion. What once felt like a complicated mystery may start looking more like a repeated pattern. For someone who is used to receiving attention, reactions, or emotional responses from another person, the sudden quiet can feel unfamiliar. They may notice that the dynamic has changed. The person who once explained, defended, or tried to repair everything is no longer playing the same role. The old emotional script no longer has the same actors. But the deeper truth is that silence does not automatically mean someone has won or lost. It is not always a strategy, a punishment, or a way to make someone return. Sometimes silence is simply the moment when two people stop creating noise long enough to hear what is actually happening inside themselves. One person may realize they missed the connection. Another may realize they missed the version of themselves they were before the emotional chaos began. One may feel the absence of attention. Another may finally feel the presence of peace. That is what makes mutual silence so powerful. It does not provide instant answers, but it removes the distractions that kept those answers hidden. It forces both people to face what remains when the constant emotional movement stops. And sometimes, the biggest shift is not that someone comes back or someone finally understands. Sometimes the biggest shift is that the person who once felt trapped in the cycle discovers they can stand still without needing someone else to choose them. Silence can feel like nothing is happening, but emotionally, it can become the loudest moment of all. When the constant messages stop, when the arguments disappear, when the cycle of chasing, explaining, defending, and trying to be understood comes to a halt, the dynamic between two people changes completely. For someone who relies heavily on control, attention, or emotional reactions from others, silence can feel unfamiliar. They may have become used to knowing they could trigger a response, restart a conversation, or pull someone back into the same emotional pattern. But when the other person stops participating in that cycle, the usual source of reassurance and influence is no longer available. The silence creates a space where there is nothing to react against, no emotional argument to win, no explanation to twist, no reaction to measure, no proof that they still have an effect on you. And that absence can force a person to confront something they may have been avoiding, the possibility that the connection is no longer under their control. Meanwhile, the person who chooses silence often experiences something completely different. At first, it may feel uncomfortable. The mind may replay old conversations, search for answers, and wonder whether the other person will return. There can be a strange emptiness because the emotional intensity that once filled every moment has suddenly disappeared. But slowly, something begins to change. The silence that once felt like punishment starts becoming protection. The distance that once felt like rejection starts becoming space to think clearly. Without the constant emotional highs and lows, you begin seeing the relationship from a different perspective. This is often the moment when the power of the old pattern begins to weaken. Not because you defeated someone, but because you stopped feeding a dynamic that was draining you. You stopped trying to convince someone to understand your pain. You stopped searching for closure from someone who may not have been capable of giving it. For some people with narcissistic traits, losing access to another person's attention or emotional energy can be deeply unsettling. They may question why the usual reactions are gone. They may wonder why attempts to reconnect no longer create the same response. The silence becomes a mirror, reflecting a reality they can no longer easily avoid. But the most important transformation happens within you. The goal of silence is not to make someone miss you or to force someone to come back. The real purpose is to reconnect with yourself. It is the moment where your peace becomes more important than proving your importance to someone else. Because the strongest silence is not the one designed to punish. It is the silence that comes from acceptance. The moment you no longer need someone else's reaction to confirm your worth is the moment you reclaim your own emotional freedom. And that is when the story changes, not because someone else finally loses control, but because you realize you never needed to give your power away in the first place. This is actually the point where the narcissist starts their real psychological unraveling. And it's also where your genuine healing begins. Stick with me, because what happens next is the part nobody ever warns you about. If any of this is starting to feel a little too familiar, keep reading, because understanding this psychological landscape is exactly how you break the cycle for good. Let's dig into this further. The moment both you and the narcissist stop reaching out to each other, the very first thing that happens on their end is something I like to call the recalibration phase. It's quiet, it's entirely internal, and most people never notice it happening because it unfolds behind closed doors long before the narcissist takes any visible action. When you go quiet, you experience it as an emotional turning point, a boundary being drawn, a step forward in your healing. The narcissist doesn't see it that way at all. To them, your silence is simply information to be analyzed, not something to be respected. They start evaluating how they lost their hold over you rather than reflecting on how their actions hurt you. Narcissists aren't wired for genuine self-reflection the way emotionally healthy people are. Instead, they run calculations. Did you get distracted? Are you trying to punish them? Did somebody else enter the picture? Are you testing their reaction? They're hunting for an angle, a motive, a potential threat to their position. Your silence turns into a puzzle they feel compelled to solve because uncertainty is deeply destabilizing for them. During this recalibration period, they might not reach out to you at all, but that quiet on their end isn't indifference, it's calculated strategy. They may keep tabs on your social media, watch who you're interacting with, or monitor your circle from a distance. They're collecting intel, waiting to see what you'll do next emotionally. Narcissists operate under the belief that anyone they once had control over will eventually come back. So they don't read your silence as closure. They read it as a temporary standoff. This is why they don't immediately panic. Instead, they wait, expecting that you'll be the one to break first, just like you always have in the past. They're banking on the same patterns they trained into you: the guilt, the fear of confrontation, the desperate hope for peace. They expect you to cave. When you don't, their internal recalibration intensifies. They start questioning whether their grip on you is actually loosening, and that's the moment the threat starts to feel real to them. In their world, silence is never just neutral. It's either a chance to reassert dominance, or it's a danger to their fragile ego. And the longer your silence lasts, the more they feel their footing slip, because your quiet disrupts the entire power structure they had grown to depend on. When you're both silent at the same time, the emotional experience of it couldn't be more different for each of you. And that gap reveals something pretty uncomfortable. You're feeling genuine loss. They're just feeling inconvenienced. When you stop reaching out, you're usually carrying the full emotional weight of everything that happened, sifting through the wreckage, the broken trust, the questions that never got answered. The sheer exhaustion of it all. You might feel sad, withdrawn, confused, even guilty. You're not just grieving the relationship, you're grieving the version of yourself who put up with so much for so long. Your silence comes from being completely emotionally maxed out. You've hit a point where your mind and body simply cannot absorb any more chaos. You're trying to reclaim your space, your dignity, your clarity. That internal battle is heavy, and it bleeds into your sleep, your self-esteem, your memories, even your sense of who you are. Meanwhile, the narcissist isn't processing the silence on any kind of emotional depth. They're not sitting with loss the way you are. They're not thinking about what went wrong, how they hurt you, or what needs to change. Instead, their first reaction comes purely from inconvenience. Your silence throws off their routine, not their heart. They've grown used to having constant access to your attention, your reactions, your apologies, your caretaking, even your arguments. All of it fed their sense of self-importance. When you go quiet, that entire supply line shuts off instantly. This doesn't shatter them emotionally, it just annoys them. They experience your absence the way someone might experience losing access to a subscription service they'd grown dependent on. It's a disruption, a delay, a frustration. They're not thinking, I lost someone who mattered. They're thinking, well, why haven't they responded yet? Your pain and their irritation exist in two entirely separate emotional universes. You're mourning an entire relationship while they're calculating how your silence impacts their ego. You're working to rebuild yourself while they're strategizing around your withdrawal. You feel the emptiness, they feel the interruption. And as time goes on, this gap only becomes more obvious. You slowly start to realize just how heavy that emotional burden really was, and how much of your true self you silenced just to keep the peace. Meanwhile, they start wondering why something that used to run so smoothly, your emotional responsiveness, has suddenly stopped working for them. The imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. Your silence pushes you further into self-reflection and healing, while it pushes them further into irritation and entitlement. The emotional weight you're carrying runs deep, while their discomfort has nothing to do with losing you and everything to do with losing the convenience of your compliance. When silence falls on both sides, the narcissist doesn't experience it as a pause or a mutual step back. They experience it as a direct challenge to their ego, because silence from someone they once had control over feels like outright rebellion to them. Narcissists view relationships through a lens of dominance, not mutual respect. So when you stop responding, stop initiating contact, stop feeding them attention, it disrupts the entire psychological hierarchy they believed they'd built. They interpret your silence as defiance, even if your only intention was to protect your peace or find some emotional clarity. To them, silence is never neutral. It's an insult. It's resistance. It's evidence that their influence might be slipping away. This is exactly why silence rattles them more than any argument ever could. Arguments actually give them relevance. Being reactive gives them power. Even anger reinforces their belief that they still hold a place in your emotional world. But silence pulls them completely off the stage. And that removal threatens the fragile story they've built about themselves. Your silence forces them to face the uncomfortable possibility that they're not as essential, desirable, or dominant as they believed. Narcissists can't tolerate ambiguity, and your lack of communication creates exactly that, a space they can't control or decode. Rather than recognizing your silence as a healthy boundary, they see it as provocation. This is when their inner narrative starts twisting. They might tell themselves you're being disrespectful, ungrateful, or manipulative. They might reframe your distance as some kind of game, convinced you're trying to bait a reaction out of them. Their ego convinces them your silence is a tactic, rather than a sign of pure exhaustion or self-protection. Some narcissists shift into a competitive mindset, treating the silence like a battle they need to win. Others will spin it as betrayal, telling themselves you abandoned them, even after months or years of them mistreating you. They rewrite the meaning behind your silence purely to protect their self-image, never to actually understand what you went through. As this psychological pressure builds, the narcissist's sense of control starts to wobble. Your silence becomes a mirror that reflects their own insecurity back at them. And instead of sitting with that discomfort, they start constructing narratives to restore their sense of superiority. They might assume you'll eventually cave because you always have before. Or they might start scheming ways to punish you emotionally for refusing to follow their script. In their mind, silence threatens their ego because it hints at something they simply cannot accept, that you may no longer be under their psychological control. When both people stop all contact, something very different happens internally for the narcissist compared to you. For you, the silence might feel like room to breathe, room to process, room to finally make sense of what you actually survived. But for the narcissist, your absence creates a kind of psychological void that forces them to face something they've spent their entire life avoiding, the loss of control. They don't think about this in terms of mutual space or shared boundaries. Instead, they interpret your disengagement as a crack in the entire system they built to hold their identity together. Narcissists don't draw self-worth from within. Their sense of self is built externally, propped up by the reactions, attention, and validation of the people around them. You were part of that structure. Your emotions, your responses, the pattern of you always coming back after conflict, all of it fed their sense of superiority and influence. When you go silent, you break that cycle. And breaking it forces them into a moment of psychological exposure. It confronts them with just how dependent they actually are on your engagement, something they refuse to admit even to themselves. They constructed a story where they were the one in charge, the dominant force, the one calling every shot. Your silence directly challenges that story. It signals that you might have stepped outside the role they assigned you, and that destabilizes the carefully curated identity they've built. Without your reactions to push against, they have nothing left to manipulate, nothing to point to as proof of their power. Your absence becomes threatening to them, not because they genuinely care about the relationship in any emotionally mature way, but because it undermines the entire foundation of control that made them feel significant in the first place. This is the point where their internal state grows restless. They might start replaying old conversations, searching for clues they missed. They might wonder if someone else has taken your place. They might begin looking for ways to reassert dominance, even before they've made any actual contact with you. The silence actually feels louder to them than it does to you because they have zero visibility into what's happening on your end. That blind spot strips away the illusion that they can predict your next move. Suddenly, they find themselves on the outside of your world instead of at its center, and that loss of centrality is something they can barely tolerate psychologically. Their mindset shifts from arrogance to anxiety, from entitlement to suspicion, from certainty to instability, all triggered by something as simple as your silence. When you and the narcissist both retreat into quiet, it might look like nothing is happening from the outside. But internally, the narcissist moves through a fairly predictable set of compensatory behaviors designed to restore their sense of control. One of the most common responses is trying to fill the void your absence created through hoovering, baiting, or triangulation. These aren't random impulses. They're deliberate psychological tools narcissists reach for when they sense their influence slipping away. Hoovering kicks in once they realize your silence isn't just a temporary blip. At first, they assume you'll come back because that's the pattern they've spent so long conditioning into you. When you don't, the panic sets in. Hoovering becomes their attempt to pull you back into the familiar cycle, not because they value you emotionally, but because losing you threatens the stability of their ego. They might send a gentle message, bring up a nostalgic memory, or manufacture some kind of crisis to draw you back in. They might act remorseful, reflective, unusually attentive. They'll shift their tone to whatever they think will actually work, because the real goal was never reconnection. It's regaining control. If hoovering doesn't land or feels too exposing for them, they'll pivot to baiting. Baiting is designed purely to provoke an emotional reaction out of you. Whether that reaction is positive or negative doesn't matter to them. What matters is being the cause of it. They might post something online specifically meant to trigger jealousy, send a cutting or dismissive message to get under your skin, or stir up unnecessary drama just to force a response. Any reaction at all, even a negative one, restores their sense of relevance. Silence takes their power away, so baiting becomes their way of poking at the wound they created, hoping you'll react just enough to prove you're still within reach. When those tactics fail too, they escalate to triangulation. This is when they bring a third party into the picture, an ex, a new partner, a friend, a family member, not out of any real desire for connection, but to craft a story that puts them back in the driver's seat. They might show off a new relationship, hint that someone else values them more, or exaggerate your silence to paint themselves as the victim. The whole point of triangulation is to make you feel replaceable, insecure, pushed aside, luring you back into either defending your worth or fighting to reclaim your place in their life. None of these behaviors are proof of love. They're proof of dependence. The narcissist survives on external validation to maintain any sense of identity, and when you cut off that supply, they scramble to patch the hole however they can. Hoovering, baiting, and triangulation are all attempts to regain psychological dominance, not emotional closeness, reactions rooted entirely in fear, entitlement, and a bruised ego, all set off by your silence. When the silence continues on both sides, something significant starts to unfold that most people don't see coming. While you might interpret the quiet as a step toward peace or closure, the narcissist experiences it as a growing sense of unease. Your silence doesn't register as calm to them. It registers as a loss of control. And because their entire identity depends so heavily on the reactions of the people they've pulled into their orbit, your lack of response sets off something like an internal alarm. What matters here is understanding this. Your quiet isn't their peace, it's their panic. Narcissists rely on emotional stimulation from other people to hold together the fragile structure of their self-worth. They need attention, admiration, conflict, drama, anything that keeps them at the center of someone else's emotional world. When you stop supplying that energy, they start to feel an internal collapse beginning. They simply don't know how to regulate themselves without outside feedback, and your silence cuts off that feedback entirely. This sets off a kind of psychological chain reaction. At first, they might try to brush off your silence, pretending it doesn't bother them. They might act unaffected, detached, even relieved. But that's just a defensive mask. As time goes on, the silence becomes harder and harder for them to ignore. Without your attention propping up their inflated self-image, they start feeling small, overlooked, irrelevant, feelings that are absolutely intolerable to them because they strike right at their core fear, being ordinary, invisible, unimportant. While you might be using that same silence to rebuild your strength and sense of self, they're experiencing it as an emotional void that threatens their entire identity. Your nervous system starts to settle without the constant tension and unpredictability they brought into your life. The fog begins clearing. You start recognizing your own worth again and reclaiming parts of yourself that got buried along the way. You find clarity in the quiet while they find chaos, and that contrast only sharpens the longer the silence goes on. They might start ruminating, replaying past interactions over and over, imagining different scenarios, inventing reasons for why you've stopped engaging. The uncertainty eats at them. They don't actually miss the relationship itself. What they miss is the reflection of themselves they used to see in your reactions. So, while your silence heals you, theirs slowly unravels them. You start finding pieces of yourself coming back together. They feel pieces of their constructed identity slipping through their fingers. What feels peaceful and necessary for you becomes agitating and threatening for them. This contrast is ultimately what exposes the imbalance that existed the whole time, showing you clearly that this same silence sets you free while it quietly falls apart around them. When silence settles in on both sides, something starts shifting inside you, often in a way that feels slow, a little confusing, and strangely relieving all at once. Your nervous system, which has been stuck in a constant state of alert throughout the relationship, finally gets a real chance to stop bracing for the next emotional hit. Relationships with narcissists create a kind of chronic hypervigilance. You learn to anticipate their moods, their reactions, their unpredictable emotional weather. Your body becomes trained to expect tension, even during moments that should feel calm. So when the silence first begins, your system doesn't relax right away. At first, it doesn't even know how. You might feel restless, agitated, uneasy with the quiet. You might even interpret the absence of conflict as a sign that something is wrong. That reaction isn't weakness, it's biology. Your body has simply been trained to live in survival mode. But as time passes, the fog starts to lift. Your mind slowly untangles itself from all that chaos. You begin noticing how different your thoughts feel when you're not constantly bracing for their next outburst or manipulation. Your sleep starts improving. You experience moments of stillness you haven't felt in years. This is your nervous system recalibrating, recognizing that the danger has finally passed. This is where real healing begins, the kind that doesn't need their permission, their apology, or any closure from them at all. This is the moment you start reclaiming all that emotional bandwidth that used to be consumed entirely by their needs, their demands, their constant crises. You rediscover your ability to think clearly, to feel your own emotions without someone twisting or dismissing them, and to make choices rooted in your own values instead of tiptoeing around someone else's temper.